release of the critically acclaimed first-person shooter Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, the video game market was perpetually flooded with war-themed games for a decade. Open-world levels and exotic weapons commonly seen in the likes of iconic shooters from the 90s were dropped in favor of linear levels and realistic weaponry. Game plots were no longer mere backdrops for the action, and a large cast of characters would be integral to what's going on. While most modern military shooters were works of fiction, loosely based on contemporary events, 6 Days in Fallujah, a third-person tactical shooter, was intended to be a virtual depiction of the Iraq War's Second Battle of Fallujah of late 2004. This was a joint offensive comprised of U.S., British, and Iraqi fighters. After the first battle in April, which took place after a small private security team were killed by Iraqi insurgents, it was discovered that an estimated 3,000 members of this militia had set up their operations within the city of 250,000 people. An emergency evacuation allowed the coalition to fight without fear of any civilians being caught in the crossfire. Collectively, over 100 coalition fighters were killed and 1,000 injured. According to the Red Cross, around 800 civilians also lost their lives during the conflict. Much of the city was left in ruins from the battle, leaving many men, women, and children homeless as a result. In summary, to call it a sweeping victory for the coalition would be painfully inaccurate. Due to the critical backlash from the mainstream press, anti-war groups and the like, 6 Days in Fallujah has remained unreleased to this very day.
This game offers a vivid depiction of one of the fiercest battles of the Iraq War, the fight for the city of Fallujah. And many U.S. military families say the game goes too far.
And soon enough, this ambitious shooter was forgotten about by practically everyone. That is, until now. Atomic Games was established in 1989 and is perhaps best known for working on the numerous entries in the real-time tactics series Close Combat. In 2003, various members of the United States Marine Corps approached the company with a proposal to develop a first-person shooter game for the purpose of training fellow members of the military. Atomic agreed, and in collaboration with Peter Tamte's Destineer Games, development on a new combat simulator was started. About a dozen soldiers would visit on occasions over the course of a year. Many of them had returned from 6 weeks of battling in Operation Iraqi Freedom. They would meet up with the team in the offices and share exciting stories, explain standard military procedures during certain situations, the pros and cons of specific weapons, and so on. All of this had proved to be invaluable to the developers. While the time spent with one another was fairly brief, strong bonds were undoubtedly made. The soldiers set off to fight in the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004. Fortunately, while some had been wounded, all the Marines we knew returned from Iraq, Tamte said. They shared tales of platoons creeping through streets, schools, warehouses, and homes in the dead of night. Some recalled instances where enemy Iraqi fighters injected large quantities of adrenaline into their veins, allowing them to sustain fatal amounts of gunfire. A slow reaction or sloppy decision could have cost them their lives. This was chilling but fascinating stuff for the team. In fact, many of the injured troops who were consequently separated from their platoon and sent back home literally pleaded to return to the war zone to continue helping their allies. Even when staring in the face of adversity and uncertainty, their sense of camaraderie and dedication was unbroken to the very end. Following the release of their collaborative project, Close Combat First to Fight, Destineer acquired Atomic Games in 2005. Meanwhile, the developers at Destineer decided to adapt the events of the conflict into a video game to be entitled 6 Days in Fallujah. Its purpose was not only to entertain, but to inform and immerse players within a realistic virtual depiction of Fallujah. In any case, the veterans agreed that video games were the greatest possible medium to capture the intensity of the situation at hand.
Get your hands up!
If you make a choice that is not on the moral high ground, you shoot an innocent, for example, the game's over for you.
Level layouts were not merely left up to the imagination. Using satellite photo technology, the developers aimed for an authentic recreation of the town of Fallujah. Unsatisfied with the latest game engines available at the time, the team decided to create an entirely new engine from scratch, allowing players to demolish the environment around them with gunfire and explosions without fears of dragging the frame rate to an indefinite standstill. Footage of interviews with Fallujah veterans would play in between missions. They would openly explain how it felt to be putting their lives on the line in such a tense scenario. It served as a reminder that the game was not attempting to conjure up Hollywood-like stunts and fight scenes for the mere purpose of amusement. Being a video game, it was not a mere attempt to recreate the entire conflict with 100% historical accuracy. While the developers emphasized the importance of authenticity, in an interview with GameSpot, creative director Juan Benito clarified that 6 Days in Fallujah would recreate the essential elements of the experience. He said the inclusion of the regenerating health system, commonly seen in other shooters at the time, was to maintain the game's accessibility, while emphasizing how it was very important for Marines who were there to take advantage of the environment they were in.
So even when we make a concession for the sake of gameplay, it's still in order to underscore the authenticity of the experience itself.
The teams at Destinier who had been developing the project were rebranded to Atomic Games shortly before 6 Days in Fallujah was officially unveiled during a press event in April 2009. When gameplay footage was shared with the public, it was received positively. On top of that, Japanese publishers Konami especially enjoyed the look of the game and wished to produce it. With an eager audience craving for a release date and a very optimistic publishing company by their side, it seemed like smooth sailing from this point on. Yet the reality was much, much harsher.
I got to get Tracy Miller in here because, Tracy, my condolences to you. You lost your son.
Very much.
You lost your son in this battle. I can never put myself in your position. But explain to me whether or not you think that this game is an honor to your son.
The game became a controversial hot topic in the mainstream press. Anti-war groups including Stop the War Coalition, as well as numerous families whose loved ones were killed in the conflict at hand, were particularly vocal with their criticisms. They feared that a video game adaptation would desensitize players, depicting death and the sacrifices made in the war as trivial or superficial. If something went wrong, one could simply restart the level if mistakes of any kind were made. But those who fought could never turn back the clock or revert a decision like that. Revealing the game this early may have been an unwise move on Atomic Games' part. In retrospect, with the Iraq War still ongoing, the wounds for many had not fully healed. No matter how enthusiastic and dedicated the veterans who helped produce 6 Days in Fallujah were, going so far as to openly defend the game on live news interviews alongside Tamti, their approval was still not enough to appease the criticism. As a result from the backlash, Konami ended up pulling out of the deal after a mere 3 weeks. Konami's vice president of marketing, Anthony Krautz, told the British newspaper The Times nothing more than a single sentence: "We are no longer doing the title at this time." It was brief and to the point, but it dodged the explanation. Why did they really pull off such a crippling U-turn? Unbeknownst to the Western press, a Konami representative elaborated to the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun in late April that the decision to pull out was a direct result of Konami receiving a considerably large amount of harsh feedback in the form of phone calls and emails. Perhaps if they were never targeted directly, the company might have been brave enough to muster through. Naturally, Tamti and the team were disappointed that their financial backers decided to cut ties with no questions asked. The CEO believed that if Konami's directors were willing to hear their side of the story, things might have taken a different turn of events. Yet this never happened. The time it took could have put Konami in an even more uncomfortable position, hence why it was decided that a quick and easy exit was the best way to get out of the picture. Down but not out, Tamti and the team forced themselves to publicly request for a new publisher to ship the game once it was finished. Unfortunately for them, while their plea was reported by various game news outlets, there were no takers. The stigma that burdened the game did not help matters in any way. A lack of funding to self-publish 6 Days in Fallujah set itself further down the spiral. The situation was indeed grim. Subsequently, things quieted down over time as development updates and the like seemingly disappeared from the public eye. Considering the state of affairs, it looked like it was to be trapped in limbo. Just under a year later, Atomic Games teased a new upcoming game entitled Breach. Rising from the ashes of its predecessor, it was constructed within the same engine, but was adapted into a multiplayer-inclusive, class-based first-person shooter. In stark contrast to the latter, there was very little emphasis on a plot. Since it was not a single-player game and thus lacked any sort of campaign mode, there was no need for an engaging story heavily inspired by real events like before. Instead of revolving around the Iraq War's second battle of Fallujah, Breach allowed players to don the role of a member of the CIA's Black Ops team. Regardless, aspects of the previous game, such as the cover system and destroyable environments, were reclaimed. Breach was distributed physically and digitally on the PC and Xbox Live Arcade in late January 2011. However, the game received mediocre reviews, primarily for its bland and unpolished gameplay. The meager collection of maps were forgettable at best, and its visuals, soundtrack, and sound design failed to impress. Some critics made comparisons between Breach and other bigger budget games storming the market, such as the acclaimed Battlefield series. There was a consensus between critics, virtually all of which agreed that there were notably better games to purchase for $15. User reviews on digital platforms like Steam echoed similar criticisms towards the game, and with each passing week, the servers started to quickly dry out. Consequently, Breach sold 15,000 copies in its first week, but buyers quickly ended up flocking to more polished AAA titles for their competitive multiplayer needs. It was not long before the servers were empty, and thus the shooter was subsequently removed from digital stores less than a year later. Realistically, 6 Days in Fallujah will likely never be released to the public officially. While the stigma surrounding the game has undoubtedly weakened over time since the end of the Iraq War in 2011, the question remains, is there any desire to release the game anytime soon? From a business standpoint, some may appreciate the developers approaching the modern warfare genre from a new angle, basing the game on actual events for the purpose of both education and entertainment. Realistically, though, releasing a dated shooter from the last decade to an audience that has predominantly lost interest in the modern warfare genre on the whole would fare little benefits to any company interested in publishing it. Regardless, the game was a chance for Atomic and the Marines of the Thundering Third to let players experience the visceral horror of Operation Phantom Fury. In a market dominated by watered-down action shooters, 6 Days in Fallujah could be a breath of fresh air and an interesting perspective on a historic world event.